We have a friend in Providence, Swami Vivekananda at the Vedanta Center in Providence. He is our official, you asked Hindu chaplain. There are many Hindu students here, of course, and we are very fortunate to convince Swami Vivekananda that he should be our Hindu chaplain for the university. He has been that for a number of years now, and he comes over on a regular basis. Well, he called us 6 months ago and told us about an outstanding speaker who was coming to town to make a speech at Brown University and at the Vedanta Center, and also some other talks in the area in New England while he's here. And that speaker is, of course, our guest tonight, Phil Goldberg, and he asked if we would like to have Phil come over and give a talk at the same time that he's here in the area. And so we jumped on it, and we asked Phil if he would come and do this for us tonight. So Phil Goldberg lives in LA, and I'll just read a few things from his, I don't have it in front of me. I do. Okay. Phil Goldberg has been studying the spiritual traditions of India for more than 40 years. And as both a practitioner and an author. He is the author of a number of books, including the one that's right here, the most recent one. And he also founded and is currently with the Center for Spiritual Wellness and Healing Association, the Spiritual Wellness and Healing Association, the SWAHA. And so he's been presenting a multimedia presentation around the country, around the Beatles and what they brought from India, their influence on the West. And so that's going to be a big topic tonight. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce and thank Phil for coming here tonight and introduce him to our group. Welcome.
Thanks, Jerry. I'm really happy to be here. Since my book came out, which is over 2 years now, I've been all over the place giving talks, and there's a lot of different venues. So I've been to a lot of yoga studios, a lot of churches, a lot of Hindu temples, but I really like coming to universities for two reasons. One, I get to see young faces, and two, makes me feel better about having dropped out of graduate school 40 years ago. At least I get some involvement with academia. And I have to say that if more than 40 years ago, there had been courses like the ones you have available here, and professors like Jerry and Maureen, I might not have dropped out of graduate school. I had to go pursue my passions independently as a writer and as a practitioner. And it all began up the road, so I always loved coming back to New England. I was living in Cambridge at the time. I started on this long winding path. I'm used to being mic'd, so can you hear me okay? If not, I'll project. So, American Veda, and my talk tonight with this brief overview, the clock in back is stuck at 40, and that's going to confuse me. So, give me a signal if we're running long. My book is 350 pages long. It could have been 850 pages straight through, and I could talk for hours. just giving the bare highlights of this complex story that I tell. And whenever I speak, I always feel like I didn't have enough time. So, mind the clock. My contention is, and I went into writing the book with this premise, and it was borne out in my research and everything that's happened since the book came out, that the impact of the teachings that have come to us over the centuries, gradually from India, and that started to come here in earnest a couple of hundred years ago and then exploded in the 60s when the baby boomers like me embraced these teachings. And gurus started to come in larger numbers, and communication, transportation was such that our access grew. But over time, the core teachings of Vedanta and the practices that we, in the repertoire of yoga, which is essentially the most prevalent of what has come to us from what we think of as Hinduism or the Vedic tradition, they have permeated the culture to such an extent that it's discernible now in surveys and polls and other objective measures. I got involved with meditation and these teachings back in the late 60s, and over time I saw that they transformed my life. I saw them transform many, many other people's lives. And then I started to see this is really having an impact here. The writer and the journalist in me started to take notes and put in the files. And back in the 80s, I thought, well, there's a book in this. But I couldn't convince any of the mainstream publishers that that was the case. So I just put it aside and kept gathering materials. And 20 years later, with the advent of the yoga boom and other factors, everything came together, and editors at Random House agreed, and so I set out to write the book, which of course took 2 years longer than I planned, because there's just so much going on and so much that has gone on. I'm going to give you a historical overview, but the contention that these teachings have affected more than individual lives, I think is quite justifiable. I tell in the first chapter, I give the sort of overview of surveys of religious attitudes and attitudes about spiritual practice and other phenomena that give evidence for that claim that eventually, let me back up. These teachings have affected psychology, they've affected healthcare, they've affected other areas of academia and scholarship, they've certainly affected the study of religion, they've affected the arts, they've affected the self-help and self-development movement, but mostly they've affected how people understand what religion is or what religion can be, how they engage their spiritual impulses, to the point where I feel safe saying we are gradually becoming a nation of yogis. And by that I don't mean everybody's going to be putting their head to their knee every day and stretching and doing hot yoga. I mean, in the largest sense of the word yoga, which means union, and which emphasizes the inner experience of union of the self, the small self, big S self. And if I'm talking language that is strange to you, let me know. Because I never know who knows what. We are becoming philosophically or theologically Vedantists, and we are becoming, in the way we practice and engage our spirituality, yogis. And I say that because even people involved in mainstream religion have shifted their orientation to the point where the Vedantic premises that there are many, many pathways to the experience of the divine or God, and many different ways of understanding the sacred and approaching the sacred, has become an accepted value and attitude in American life. The fact that most Americans now say their highest priority spiritually is their inner experience of the divine, and that they have become what sociologists or religion call questers as opposed to nesters, that they're less important to them is their identification with the religion of their heritage. What matters most is their independent search for spiritual truth and spiritual experience. This is very Vedantic, it's very yogic, and the surveys show that we're moving in that direction. I don't want to bore you with all this evidence talk, but I'm going to show you a short video that to me is the best evidence that these teachings have permeated the culture.
Namaste. And you write this down because this is something we're going to be using every Sunday from now on. And men, I need you to get it. Ladies, I want you to get it, but especially I want my men and boys to get it. N-A-M-A-S-T-E. That's a Hindu term. Namaste. Say that. Say it again. Namaste, Jerome, means the divinity within me salutes the divinity within you. Y'all missed it. Namaste means the divinity within me salutes the divinity within you. Now, flag, this simply means I recognize that Bobby has some God in him. See, many of our boys don't have any respect for life. That's why it's so easy to kill them. So when I realize that Bobby got some God in him, just as I have some God in me, that will make me respect him not only physically, but I respect what I say about him. We have not been taught to respect one another, so I need you to say it again. Namaste. Say it again. Namaste. The divinity within me salutes the divinity. Any teaching going on here today? And maybe that's why we have been mistreating one another for much too long. I want us to start today to say that word over and over. I want men and women, young and old, to start greeting one another instead of saying, what's happening? Young folks, when you greet somebody, namaste. Say it. Namaste. Say it again. Namaste. What does that mean? Then you want to be salute. So don't know what's happening, bro. Because that ain't kept our boys from killing one another. They've been saying it for a long time. What's happening, bro?
He was doing more than giving him a vocabulary, right? This is a shift, a theological shift from the way the divine is usually understood and talked about in churches. So let me go back to the beginning of this transmission and give you a historical overview. It begins in America, in earnest, with these guys, particularly Emerson, also Thoreau and Whitman. You all know them. You are a stone's throw away from where they hung out in Cambridge. I mean in Concord, but also Cambridge. Back in the day when there were no yoga studios in Concord, and no meditation centers in Barry and kind of Cambridge and so forth. They came upon teachings of India, teachings of Hinduism and Buddhism from some of the earlier translations and commentaries. And it had a big impact, beginning with Emerson. How many have read Emerson? You mean there on the side, Emerson? Time to grab some? How many have read Thoreau? More. Yeah, usually more, because you read Walden. Because you notice that in Walden, he calls himself a yogi, and he talks about reading the Bhagavad Gita every day. He borrowed that book from Emerson and had it with him at Walden Pond. I interviewed over 300 people for my book, and I would ask them how they first got interested in Indian spiritual teachings, and a lot of them said when they read Walden, and they were, because they loved Thoreau, and if he liked this book called the Bhagavad Gita, they'll go out and get them one. And now, of course, you can do that easily. You can get 30 translations online with a click of the mouse. Wasn't the case when I looked for the Gita in the streets of New York a long, long time ago. Emerson was far more profoundly impacted by the teachings of India than is readily obvious. But scholars who have studied these things make a convincing case that Emersonian philosophy is deeply embedded deeply within it are sort of core teachings of the East, particularly sort of Advaita Vedanta ideas. I think of Emerson, how many here would identify with the cohort called spiritual but not religious? It's the fastest growing cohort in American religion. I think he was the original. Long before the term existed, he was the original and has become quite a hero to me and other people. It all began with them, and anybody who has read them has been getting a taste of India, even if whether they know it or not. And that's a big part of the story that I tell in my book, that more people have been affected by these core teachings from India than realized. Because what happens is, as happened with them, people are affected by these ideas and these practices. They absorb them, they assimilate them in their lives, they in some way communicate the same ideas to other people, and it spreads. And some people who are affected by these ideas take them in, combine them with other sources of knowledge in their own areas of expertise, and express them in their own way. And some of those people reach millions of people through books, through lectures, through television, through the media. And some of those people become transmitters of these teachings, often in ways that are so subtle because the language changes and the articulation changes that they affect people who have no idea anything Indian is going on. And that's how this all happens. So you can read Emerson, and if you read certain passages where he doesn't talk about reading these books from India, you will just be moved by his ideas, not knowing that part of it stems from India. But later in the 19th century, the founders of what came to be called the New Thought movement. Are you familiar with that term? So this is Madame Blavatsky, who started Theosophy. This is Mary Baker Eddy, who started Christian Science, also up in this neighborhood, a little further north. Those schools of metaphysics were deeply impacted by the teachings of India and transformed into the language of Theosophy, Christian Science, and later through Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, the Unity churches, and later through Ernest Holmes, the religious science teaching or science of mind. These churches now, or centers of spirituality, whatever they're called, are hugely popular, more popular than they ever were. And a lot of people who show up on Sunday morning and hear their ministers speak in a quasi-Christian way, but in a very different way, are often not aware that their founders were adapting the teachings of India into sort of Western Christian form. Then came a turning point in 1893 when Swami Vivekananda came. How many know about Vivekananda? He's probably mentioned here in this series. You probably hear a lot about it this year because it's the 150th anniversary of his birth, and India and Indian Americans are doing a lot to commemorate him. In fact, that's where last night at the Vedanta Center in Providence, that was the centerpiece of the message. I think of Vivekananda as the Jackie Robinson of this story. And you know, yes, please, young people, tell me you know who Jackie Robinson is, because it would break my heart if you did. And especially this week with this movie about him coming out, and it's apparently a big hit and everything. Vivekananda was the first. He was the first guru from India to come here, the first Swami. And in 1893, when he came to speak at the Parliament of the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago, and spoke here in Cambridge and Boston, he was coming at a time when most Americans had never even met a Jew, and when Catholics were being discriminated against. New immigrants. It was an overwhelmingly Protestant country, let alone a country that would be friendly to a dark-skinned Indian heathen. But, and many weren't. There was a backlash. But he was also mildly embraced and became the superstar of that gathering in Chicago. And it's an astonishing story, and I encourage you to read about it because he encountered these two kinds of Americans, the ones who were denouncing him for preaching false religion and claiming he was the work of the devil, and the others who were open-minded and curious and said, wait, he makes sense, this is rational, he's not asking me to become a Hindu, he's just teaching what he calls universal spiritual principles. I want to hear more. He's smart, he's articulate. And he became the star of the show and stayed here a few years and started opening these Vedanta centers, which were the first teaching institutions in the West for people interested in Vedic teachings of India. And now they would spread. And the early part of the 20th century, that was pretty much where people went if they were interested in Indian teachings. And then in the 1940s, 50s, some of the most important thinkers in Western history, recent Western history at least, were mentored by swamis of the Vedanta centers, and then went on to transmit these ideas to massive numbers of people. In Los Angeles, for instance, the Vedanta Center up in Hollywood that still exists was run by Swami Vivekananda, here looking like a proper English gentleman. And he was with two other really proper English gentlemen, Aldous Huxley and Christopher Isherwood. Do you know who they were? Isherwood was already famous for the stories called Berlin stories that were the basis for the play movie Cabaret and other works of fiction. Huxley was already famous for The Brave New World and other things. Now they started to study Vedanta, and you could see that reflected in the work in the later parts of their lives. They attracted a lot of intellectuals to the Vedanta Center in LA. They started the Vedanta Press, which published anthologies and journals. And Isherwood and Prabhupada teamed up for 3 or 4 translations and commentaries, one on the Gita, one on the Yoga Sutras, and a few others, that were the most easily accessible and popular translations of those sacred texts into the 50s and 60s and 70s. I still have the copies I've read in the late 60s. I can prove it because it's 95 still. And Huxley went on to write The Perennial Philosophy, which many of you may be familiar with, and other works that incorporated the vision of Vedanta and the core ideas of Vedanta in fiction and nonfiction. In St. Louis, around the same time, Swami Satprakashananda was holding forth, and a young scholar named Houston Smith was studying with him. How many know Houston? He's, of course, most famous for having written the foreword to American Vedic. But he was well known even before getting that assignment. He's probably, you can correct me, you scholars here, but I would think he's probably the most important, certainly the best known scholar of religion in the later, at least our era. And his whole approach to the study of comparative religion was strongly and profoundly influenced by his study of Vedanta teachings. And he famously would always call himself a Methodist. He would go to church. He told the story on public television once of going to church every Christmas Eve and bringing his family home and having dinner, then going to the Vedanta Society to hear the Swami speak about Jesus, and that he got it right. and in the way his church did. So he was always an eclectic guy, but his whole understanding, his famous textbook, which has been read by 5 or so million people, and if any of you take the course and you're assigned it, be very grateful, because it changed the way people understood and taught comparative religion. Talk about any of these people for hours. This is Joseph Campbell, who had a similar experience in the 40s and 50s in New York with Swami Vivekananda, who was a great scholar of Vedanta, and he collaborated with Campbell for some works, and Campbell's whole subsequent career as a very famous public intellectual and scholar of comparative religion, comparative mythology, had this sort of unifying vision that is very compatible with Vedanta. So, also studying in New York at that same center was J.B. Salinger. How many have read Salinger? How many have read anything other than The Catcher in the Rye? If you do read Fran Mazui or some of the other works, you will see a really wonderful attempt at depicting spiritual seekers of enlightenment in the yogic sense, who are also trying to live a life in the real world of Manhattan in the 1950s, early 60s. He was a deep student of those teachings, and you'll see it explicitly laid out in his work. So people who were Salinger fans were getting doses of Indian philosophy and philosophies of Buddhism and mystical Christianity mixed in with his storytelling. And most critics and literary people just thought Salinger likes to write about weird people. But if you were a seeker who was interested in these ideas, you had characters to identify with and to learn from. I'm going to read quick section of his short story, Teddy. How many read Teddy? This was published in 1952 in the New Yorker, and it's one of the famous collection of 9 stories in a book form. So Teddy was a 10-year-old boy. I just want to give you a taste of the kind of things Salinger would insert in his fiction, and that probably New Yorkers reading this found amusing. Teddy was a 10-year-old boy who remembered his past lives. And he said that he had been making very nice spiritual advancement as a holy man in India. But then he met a woman and fell from grace. And he says, I met a lady and I sort of stopped meditating. I would have had to take another body and come back to Earth anyway, because I wasn't that far advanced. But I wouldn't have had to get incarnated in an American body, because it's very hard to meditate and live a spiritual life in America. People think you're a freak. My father thinks I'm a freak. And my mother thinks that it's bad for my health. And so forth. So people were getting a dose of that particular aspect of Indian philosophy, having to do with karma and reincarnation. But then he sort of nails Indian philosophy with this, and he says to the guy he's talking to, I was 6 when I saw that everything was God, and my hair stood up. My sister was a tiny child. She was drinking her milk, and all of a sudden I saw that she was God, and the milk was God, and all she was doing was pouring God into God. And that's a kind of vision of the unity of that everything is divine that is an aspiration on the path of yoga. So we'll move on. When I asked those 300 people how they got involved in these teachings, many of them would say, I was curious about life and somebody gave me a book to read, the book changed my life. Many books were mentioned. This was the most often mentioned. How many know the Autobiography of Yogi? How many have read it? It's astonishing how much of an impact that book has had. Yogananda wrote it, published it in 1946, he died in 1952, and it still sells thousands of copies every year. I'm told that it's sold well over 5 million, and I can tell you that at least in the 60s and 70s, for everybody who bought a copy, probably 10 people read it because we passed it around to each other. I still have a copy, $5 hardcover that I read back then. And I know I didn't have $5 back then. So I'm sure I borrowed it from someone who never returned it. So I'm making up the karma by promoting the view. Yogananda is interesting in a lot of other ways as well. He came in 1920 and became the first of the important gurus to settle in America, and he lived here the rest of his life, 32 years, made his headquarters Los Angeles. Has any of you ever been to LA or Southern California, seen the places?
I tried to, it was closed down.
Was that?
I tried to, it was closed down.
Oh, no. Well, go back. They had, all their properties in Southern California are incredible. He had the best real estate farm of any of the gurus. They had a tremendous, now I want to just use it as an example of something. Because all the gurus that came here had a similar quality. They had a great, they were very, do you know the word upaya? It means skillful means. And they were very skillful in adapting these abstract teachings from another culture and another era to the West in ways the Westerners could respond to, not feel threatened by, and adapt and assimilate into their lives, regardless of their religious orientation, or whether they were completely secular or atheist or whatever. They were presented as universal teachings and practices that you can do on your own terms, and that's how they were embraced. Yogananda saw that Americans get religious on Sunday mornings, so his organization, the Self-Realization Fellowship, said, well, let's have services on Sunday morning. So what in India would be called a satsang, a gathering of the followers, became a church service, essentially, and their places had rows of pews or chairs and an altar, but the altar has the whole Yogananda guru lineage and Jesus, and the whole thing looks like you're in a Presbyterian church, except the message is very different, and the songs are traditional Indian bhajans, along with some hymns that Yogananda wrote that I don't write, because they're in English. Anyway, so that, we don't have much time. Greetings. So, subsequent to Yogananda, subsequent to the publication of the book, I want to move into another era. Whoops. Yeah. There are a few great spiritual masters of India who had a big impact on the culture, who never came here. And I'm just going to briefly pay homage to Ramana Maharshi. How many know who Ramana Maharshi is? And this is Sri Aurobindo. How many know her? So both of these great holy men died in 1950. During their lives, very few people in the West knew anything about them. If you read books by a British writer called Brunton, if you happened to read a Life magazine article in May of 1949, you would have known about Ramana Maharshi. If you read Somerset Maugham's great novel, The Razor's Edge, you would have read about a guru who was a model on Ramana Maharshi. But that's about it. Now, he is way better known in the West than he was in his lifetime. That face is probably on more yoga studio walls and home altars than any other Indian face, with the possible exception of Yogananda. So it's remarkable. And there's a reason for that. It has to do with people who were followers of his, who became teachers, who made other people teachers, who came to the West, and the advent of the internet and the publication of all of his works and spoken word, so he's become tremendously popular. Aurobindo is less well known, but has had a huge impact, and I'm going to show you a kind of chain of influences that begin with him. How many have been to Esalen in Big Sur? You know about Esalen. Esalen is too. Some. It was started by these two guys, Dick Price and Michael Murphy. Michael, who's now 82 or something, was a student at Stanford in the early 50s, and he got interested in Indian philosophy, and he read Aurobindo, got extremely excited. After graduation, went to India, lived in the Aurobindo ashram, and came home and said, I want to start an institute that would combine the best of the East and the best of the West, and will explore the higher reaches of consciousness and human potential, and that became Esalen. And among the people teaching there in the early 60s were people we met earlier, Aldous Huxley, Joseph Campbell, Jason Smith, and others, including Abraham Maslow, and people, how many know Maslow, the great psychologist? So out of this ferment of East and West in Esalen and the Bay Area in general, came something called the San Francisco Renaissance. And Aurobindo's teachings were a big part of it, so were all the other Eastern teachings. Maslow and other psychologists went on to then transform psychology and introduce self-actualization theory and concepts of peak experience. New forms of psychotherapy come into play. New theories of human development come into play, all informed by various teachings from what we think of as Hinduism and Buddhism. And that project continues to this day. And it was centered then back in the Bay Area, where largely around a place called the American Academy of Asian Studies, which was started by Frederick Spiegelberg, who had been Michael Murphy's professor, and staffed by two devotees of Aurobindo, who were sent here by Aurobindo, and by this then unknown guy named Alan Watts. Alan Watts. All the young people don't know Alan Watts, but you can hear him online. And he became one of the great beatniks of all time. A real rogue and rascal, and one of the great interpreters of Asian religion and Asian spiritual teachings, all of them, and a great writer, and probably the leading voice of Asia in the West for in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And, well, we say a lot about Watts, but we won't. And among the people who were influenced by this whole thread were the beat poets of San Francisco, who then integrated Buddhist ideas and Hindu ideas into their work, thereby spreading it through hip poetry and art. That's Allen Ginsberg, the leader of the crew, who was known for being a Buddhist, but was also a great bhakta. That is to say, he loved the devotional practices of Hinduism and would be seen chanting with the Hare Krishna people in all the counterculture events and anti-war events. And you can go online and find footage of Alan chanting Om and other mantras to pacify crowds at anti-war rallies. All right, I'm going to give you a taste. This is the entertainment portion of the evening, when Alan, being a great provocateur, introduced the nation to the Hare Krishna mantra. When, how many remember William Buckley was? Our young people. He was the arch-conservative of his period, and a staunch Catholic, and to the right of Ronald Reagan politically. But he had a national talk show and was smart enough or foolish enough to invite Allen Ginsberg on one night, and this is what transpired.
I think it wasn't their power, it's power. It's our power. It's the earth reflecting the system. It's reflecting the power. Like a bar of control. The more we think in terms, you give yourself a rest to read more question. So, interested in politics, you won't even know. That's a little bit of language. I don't
60s finally, and I know many of you here weren't born yet, but your parents are probably in that age. Whatever you heard about the 60s is true. I don't care what you heard, it's true. It was a crazy time, and there was a lot going on, and a lot of it was destructive and mad. But it was also a time of great and genuine searching for truth, searching for answers to the big existential questions of life, and how do you live a fulfilled life. And in that mix was a lot of drug taking, and a lot of the drug taking led to transcendent experiences, but also to crashing and destruction. And so a lot of people were listening to certain elders, like some of the people we already mentioned, and they were saying, if you're interested in these spiritual experiences and spiritual ideas, look to India. So we started reading Alan Watts and Aldous Huxley and people like that, and getting the sense that there's more out there, and India has something to do with it. And into this mix came music. So this happened. Where is it? Which was the first time most people heard of sitar. And sitar then caught on and became sort of the musical backdrop of the hippie era. And it all started because George, if you're a certain age, you're on first name basis with all the Beatles. George discovered a sitar on the set of the movie Help, really liked the sound, and studied it, put it on Norwegian wood, and then wanted to study some more. And so he was introduced to Ravi Shankar. Ravi Shankar had been coming to the West for about 10 years by then, and was well known in classical music circles, and then jazz circles, where people like John Coltrane became very close friends of his. Coltrane and his wife became practitioners of Indian spirituality. And Alice Coltrane actually went on to become a Swami with her own ashram in Los Angeles up until her death 5-6 years ago. But larger mass media music scene hadn't heard new music until George put the sitar on that record, and then when they became friends, because everything the Beatles did was front-page news every day, practically. Then everybody heard of Ravi Shankar, they wanted to hear his music. He became a superstar, played Woodstock, played Monterey Pop Festival, was playing for thousands of rock and roll fans, and suddenly became a spokesperson, not just for Indian music, but for the deep underlying spiritual teachings that gave rise to Indian classical music, and a great force in telling people more about these ideas that were then starting to percolate. We would tell people you shouldn't be taking drugs to come here and play, you should go meditate and do yoga instead. But what also happened was, George went to study with Ravi Shankar. Ravi said, you should read these books. So he read Vivekananda's Raja Yoga, and he read Yogananda's Autobiography, and he said, now I see this is my spiritual path. And George became as Hindu as any Westerner could possibly be for the rest of his life, and became a tremendous force for this transmission of Indian spiritual ideas into the culture. And then it led to this moment when, in 1967, George's wife took them to hear Maharishi Mahesh Yogi talk about his transcendental meditation. The Beatles learned that practice, and the whole world changed overnight. This was like such an important moment that, well, This was an important moment. A few months later, the second most important moment was when they went off to India to be with their guru and meditate in an ashram. That was the first time most people had heard the word ashram. When they started to meditate and tell all their fans that that's where it's at, and drugs were not, overnight everybody learned there was something called meditation. And it wasn't just for weirdos and the monks in caves. It was something anybody could do. And that these guys, who are the richest, most famous people in the world, could go off and sit in a funky ashram for a few months with their eyes closed. Maybe there's some value in this stuff. And overnight, people knew what a mantra was, and people knew what a guru was. Everything changed. I called their spiritual retreat in India the most important spiritual retreat since Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness. And when I wrote that in my book, I thought I'm going to get in trouble for this. But I figured, what the hell? John Lennon was getting in trouble, so I might as well get in trouble for saying it. And nobody has rejected it. The book's been out over 2 years. I haven't gotten one angry email. So either no one's reading the book, or it's true. It's like, it must be true, because it really had this enormous impact. I went back and looked at the magazine, the newspaper coverage at the time. This was, for example, Look magazine in 1968. Cover stories like this were happening, news articles were happening, and this was the thrust of it. It's really interesting looking back. Meditation hits the campus, Hindu monk Maharishi turns the students on without drugs. Parents at the time were so scared that their kids were going to get drug-addled and drop out of school and become, basket cases, that if they took up meditation instead, that was weird, and they would much rather have had them go to church. But it was better than them freaking out on drugs and having to be bailed out or sent to rehab. And that was the thrust of the publicity. But the result was that responsible grown-ups, like psychologists and doctors, said, what's going on here? And they started doing studies on meditation. That was the beginning. Now, as you all know, studies like on mindfulness and various forms of meditation and on yoga practices are very common. Hundreds upon hundreds have been published in reputable journals. And back then, people forget this somehow. But the first study was done on TM and was published in a reputable journal, and then Scientific American and Science Magazine in 1970. And Herbert Benson from Harvard picked up on it, and he started doing studies on it. And I know, because I was one of the subjects, I sat in Herbert Benson's cubicle at Harvard Medical School with a blood pressure cuff and meditated. So I can verify that that's when it started to happen. This was tremendously important. It's the beginning of the mainstreaming of yoga and meditation into the culture, and the secularization of these ancient spiritual practices now becoming medical practices, psychotherapy practices with discernible, verifiable, measurable results. So now, if you go to your HMO or your health plan and they tell you to meditate to lower your blood pressure or reduce your anxiety, trust me, it would not have happened 40 years ago. But this is the beginning of that legitimization and mainstreaming. And it happened rather quickly because these studies were done in the early 70s. So this is the 1968 cover story. This is the 1975 cover story. Same guru, same meditation practice, but instead of it being about young hippies getting off of LSD to meditate, it's about their parents getting off of Valium and about antidepressants and so forth. it had gone mainstream. And now the meditating celebrities on television were not rock stars. They were Mary Tyler Moore and Clint Eastwood. So there it is. Then we have the 70s explosion of all the other gurus, because now the ground had been broken. And we don't have time to discuss all of them. I profile all of them in my book, and there are others. So if your favorite guru's not up here, it's just that there was no room. But they all had an impact, and the scholars here can tell you that each of them brought out a different facet of the multifaceted teachings of the Vedic tradition. Yogananda, for example, brought out Kashmir Shaivism. A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami was a great Bhakta, and he brought Krishna chanting, what we think of the Vaishnavite tradition. Satchidananda and Vishnudevananda were devotees of Swami Shivananda in Rishikesh, and Satchidananda became very famous in 1969 because he opened the Woodstock Festival with some chanting and so forth. All of these guys had their own characteristics, their own teachings, their own foibles, which is a whole other story. And I have to devote a chapter to in the book. And then people like Iyengar and Papa Joyce brought Hatha Yoga, systematization of that, and we had that. And then we had the new phenomenon happening, which is very important, which was Westerners becoming sort of authoritative representatives of these teachings. And the first and most important was Ramdas, who had been Richard Alpert, used to present for you. I'm sure I'm going on. You know the story of Richard Alpert becoming Ramdas? Look it up. Go Google it. And other Westerners, this is Ramdas's famous book, Here Now. Other Westerners started to absorb these teachings and bring it to their areas of expertise. Dean Ornish in medicine, Deepak Chopra leaves medicine and becomes a sort of all-purpose spiritual teacher. Ken Wilber, most of you know, as a kind of ad hoc philosopher. All of them and many, many others absorbing these teachings from these and adapting them into their own fields of expertise, and then serving as transmitters to the general public in one form or another. And some Americans became gurus with their own devotees in traditional sort of guru-disciple fashion, only with the quirky American ways. These are some of those who did that. And here a very important piece of it. Mainstream religious leaders like Thomas Murray and B. Griffiths and Thomas Keating up the road here at Spencer Monastery were influenced by the teachings of the East and reinterpreted and reformulated their own traditions using ideas and practices from the East. Keating started centering prayer, which is huge in the main form of contemplative Christian practice. He had adapted ideas from the folks at Insight Meditation in Barry and from the TM Center in Cambridge, and then took the TM teaching manual and adapted it so he could democratize Christian mystical practices and make them available to people. So you had this sort of transformation that is ongoing of Christianity and Judaism, because there's sort of rabbinical equivalents of these people practicing forms of Jewish meditation, using Hebrew mantras instead of Sanskrit mantras. The whole thing is fascinating. And then, of course, new gurus came about. These are the two most famous ones. Yes, we will admire my use of product placement.
Very nice.
It's one of my favorite pictures of gurus. It's not Photoshop. And then the Hatha Yoga boom.
Phil, you should just interrupt just a second. We've got about 20 minutes left, 25 minutes.
I'm winding up.
Right, well, that's up to you. But I just wanted to let you know.
Good.
We might want to save some time for book signing if anybody buys books for anything like that.
We're winding up. So then it takes on different forms, this transmission, and in recent years, Hatha Yoga is the main form, and now there's this upsurge of the Bhakti tradition and the Kirtan phenomenon, where these Kirtanwalas doing traditional Kirtan, but with a sort of Western musicality, have become superstars. I'm about to go next weekend after this. I'm one of the speakers at a 3-day yoga and music festival in rural Indiana, where they'll be doing traditional Sanskrit chanting all the time and having yoga classes and all that. This is, 40 years ago, it was just the Hare Krishnas doing this form of devotional practice, and we all thought they were nuts. And now, it's a sort of legitimate spiritual practice and an art form. And I know this because I live in LA. There's talk of Kirtan becoming a Brahmin category. That's how how popular it is. Even now in hip hop. If you haven't heard MC Yogi, go Google him. He's a young yoga teacher who transmits these teachings through hip hop. It's good stuff. Yeah, good stuff. And we'll leave that up there as a subliminal cue to either buy the book or go home and check out the website or buy it online. And I too have a mailing list if you want further information that I send out, sort of updates and new information all the time. And we will now open it up. Great.
Here's the list. If you, as you go out before you guys want to leave an email address, is that what they want here?
Yeah.
To be notified about the book. Well, thank you so much. A lot of my old friends are, as you may know, because I spent a lot of years in California. I didn't know Houston Smith wrote your, you didn't be an old friend of mine.
Is that right?
Yeah. I have a question. I have several questions. I'm wondering if that's, you showed a photo of the Institute of Asian Studies.
American Academy of Asian Studies.
Right, exactly.
That became CIIS.
Exactly where I taught.
Did you?
I was effective there. But, and I'm wondering, was that Chowdhury?
The little Indian guy next to Alan Watts was Dr. Chowdhury.
Yeah. That's interesting. I've never seen a picture of him. He was dead.
And his wife carried on the Cultural Integration Fellowship, which still exists in San Francisco.
A couple of things. One thing I'd like to point out, actually, which you may or may not know, the New Bedford and Dartmouth have a very close relationship with Thoreau and the Transcendentalists.
Really?
Yeah, there's a park. Thoreau, everybody knows about Walden. It's a little hot. But he had one here.
Really?
Yeah. It was built by one of his devotees. If he called himself a yogi, he had a devotee. And the devotee was a local historian named Daniel Ricketson. Very famous. And wrote many books about the history of the local people here. And there's a point just a few miles from here called Ricketson Point.
Well, maybe I'll have to visit it in the morning and take on.
In what's now Brooklawn Park in New Bedford, that's where Daniel Ricketson lived. That was his estate. It was all woods. I don't know, maybe 100 acres or something like that. And he built on, because he liked Thoreau so much, he used to have Thoreau come down and to make him feel comfortable, he built him a model of Walden. It's Walden now.
Really?
Yeah. ego and rubbing poop on it. But if you can work your way through, you'll see this is a plaque which was dedicated when to Thoreau and Emerson and a few other transcendentalist friends who actually came down on a regular basis to see Wicked.
Wow.
So, an interesting historical piece.
And I should have said this when the students were still here, but I went through the Beatles piece of it quickly, of course, but I'm doing a whole presentation just on them with music and everything. Tomorrow night in Arlington, Mass, at a yoga center called Arlington Center. So if you want to come up and have a groovy Beatles evening, come on up or tell your friends to come in. Are there questions? We probably have all the time. Yes?
The Ornish, Dr.
Dean Ornish, yeah. Dean Ornish, who was very famous now for his research on heart disease and heart disease prevention. His whole protocol was based on what he learned from Swami Vivekananda, who had been his guru. It's in my book, and Ornish is open about this now. He had to be very careful in the early days. So the Hatha Yoga was called stretching exercises, and the meditation was stress reduction. And he had to be very careful. But the whole vegetarian, low-fat protocol, it's all based on Satchidananda. When Ornish was a medical student, and he's open about this, so I don't mind telling you, he was suicidal. And his mother said, oh, there's a yogi coming. I'm going to invite him to give a talk in the living room. And it changed Ornish's life. He became a close friend and devotee of Satchidananda. And he based his protocols on those teachings. Yeah. Anything? Yeah.
I read there's some speculation that Christ between the age of 12 and 33 went to India and studied and taught there. Wouldn't that have far superseded the Beatles going to India?
It would have if we could prove it, yeah. And you know, for a few rupees, I can show you exactly where he lived and was buried, because he's buried in India. He had a bar mitzvah in India. No, there has always been that speculation. There's people who claim, they have proof, but it's all dubious scholars. Jerry.
With all your experiences in this exciting area, do you have a special guru yourself?
Well, I was one of the people who took up TM in 1968, after the Beatles put it on the map. I was actually living in Cambridge then, and became a teacher of that. So I spent a lot of time with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi in the early 70s. And then I left that, and I've been a kind of freelance ever since. Any guru who will hold my book can be photographed. I spent time with others, but I'm not a disciple. At the New York Independence Street. Yeah.
Do you have a future prediction for the next wave of Vedic wisdom that's coming?
I have to tell you, the first time I gave a talk after the book came out, someone asked me that, and I was like stunned. The first what came out of my mouth was, it was hard enough to get the pass right. And to this day, I'm being corrected on certain things that I thought I was so meticulous about. Just last night, Swami Vivekananda told me that the section in the book about Houston Smith meeting the Swami in St. Louis and all that, that the chronology was off, and Houston, being 90 years old, just didn't remember it. And, so the future, all I can say from my own studies and observations, and it's more than observations, because of the book, I'm out there and talking to the leaders in the yoga community, Hindu leaders and people like that. So there's some, it's not just a hunch. My sense is that, this sounds like a cop-out. These trends, this sort of people becoming more, have their outlooks becoming more of what we think of as sort of core Vedantic principles, becoming interested in contemplative practices. That's just going to continue to grow. That's sort of inexorable. Americans are pragmatic people. We're nuts in many ways and irrational in many ways, as you can see in the news. But ultimately, if something works, it becomes mainstream and people take it up. If it makes sense, it's not threatening. There'll be backlash, like there's backlash now among fundamentalists who are trying to get people not to do yoga because it's the devil. But it hasn't stopped people from doing yoga. And that, because it works and it helps people. Meditation is good for people. This kind of pluralism that the Hindu tradition has always represented makes sense in the pluralism world. And that's going to grow. But what forms it will take, I don't know. I mean, who could have predicted that kirtan chanting would be as big as it is now? I spoke at Bhakti Fest, a 4-day festival outside LA, 2 hours from LA in the high desert. This is the 4th year. 3,000 people show up. And it's kirtan chanting around the clock on one stage after another, yoga classes all day. And, you know, when they need a break, they come hear someone like me or, you know, some scholar give a talk. 3,000 people. But the other thing that's new is the presence in America of people of Indian descent, building temples and practicing more traditional forms of Hinduism, which is not mainly what came before. Somewhere that's going to have an effect. You know, you now have first, second generation people of Hindu origins going to school and being your doctor and marrying your sister and all that, and that's going to, you know, have an effect. I don't know what that will bring about, but you know, one of these days there'll be an all-star shortstop named Patel, and he'll take the day off on Shivaratri like Sandy Koufax took off on Yom Kippur, and that'll have an effect. I don't know what's coming next, but it's going to be interesting to see. I suspect one of the things that's going to happen is the Hatha Yoga will mature and deeper spiritual teachings will become more prominent in the yoga community. And I know a lot of people are hoping to make that happen. Yoga studios, it wouldn't shock me if like down the road, yoga studios are doing rites of passage for people who feel more comfortable with that as their spiritual community than their church or synagogue or whatever. But those, I don't know. Okay, Jerry, you go. Trungpa Rinpoche.
Yeah.
I left out all the Buddhists.
Yeah.
Because
You left out all what?
the Buddhists.
Yeah.
The book doesn't talk about the Buddhists.
Okay. All right.
If you're asking about Trungpa.
Yeah. But he has an connection with, Allen Ginsberg, for example.
Yes, and the Brahmins. And that, and the Ropa, which he started, is an important piece of the story. But
Is it in your work?
What?
Is it in your work?
I mentioned it, but in passing. I mentioned all the Buddhist teachers in passing. It would have been twice as big a book if I included the American Buddhist story, which is parallel to this.
Right.
But it had also been done. There's a book called When the Swans Came to the Lake. That's the history of Buddhism in America. Anything else? Thank you for coming.